Section 4 of Imperialism and World Politics, Part 1 of 4, by Parker Thomas Moon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Chapter 3b. Why Europe Shouldered the White Man's Burden. Subsection French Logic ex post facto. It has been a favourite axiom of English critics that French men pursue logic à outrance, regardless of practical expediency. As a matter of fact, French statesmen are adept in the fine art of making expediency appear logical. It was to justify the conquests upon which they had already launched that the rulers of the Third Republic elaborated their remarkable theory of imperialism. The logic was ex post facto. The Third French Republic inherited a colonial empire of less than 1 million square kilometres and 5 million inhabitants, an empire whose total commerce amounted to only 600 million francs, a third of which was with foreigners, an empire which cost the French treasury 30 million francs a year in administrative expense, an empire which was quite generally considered by French economists, politicians, and businessmen to be burdensome and unprofitable. Few voices were raised in its defence in the first decade of the Republic. It is rarely necessary to argue in defence of possessions. It was the new acquisitions that required justification. Tunis and Tonkin were the conquests that needed apology. The seizure of Tunis in 1881 would probably not have occurred had not the adjoining country of Algeria, on the North African coast, been a French possession since 1830, when a desperate king had endeavoured to save his tottering throne by a brilliant foreign venture. Tonkin, likewise, neighboured a French possession, Cochin China, which had been acquired by the ambitious Louis Napoleon. A merchant's ambition to found an establishment there led to a minor military expedition, only 180 men, but by almost miraculous fortune this handful of soldiers had won for the French Republic in 1874 a protectorate over the extensive empire of Annam. This protectorate in turn led to a controversy with the Chinese government, which claimed sovereignty over Annam, and to war against the pirates who infested the border province of Tonkin. Hence the famous Tonkin expedition of 1883, which resulted, later, in a further extension of French empire. The Tunis expedition of 1881 and the Tonkin expedition of 1883, costly affairs both, required parliamentary votes of credit and parliamentary justification. There was strong opposition in the chamber. One speaker pointed out that French colonies furnished less than 200 million francs out of a total French commerce amounting to 9 billions. Another declared,
"Instead of throwing yourself into the pursuit of new colonies which are supposed to be attractive because of alleged veins of gold, which you do not know, not having seen them, and of alleged coal mines of whose existence you are ignorant, although you proclaim them and indicate them on your fanciful maps, in order that public opinion may accompany you in this distant adventure. France will tell you not to look so far away. It is in France that you should look, and it is the poverty in France that must be alleviated."
Georges Clemenceau violently rebuked the imperialist cabinet.
"The tempter has led you to a high mountain, has shown you the nations at your feet, inviting you to make your choice, and you have made it."
It was to defend himself against such assaults that Jules Ferry stepped up to the tribune as master of imperialist logic. He had been responsible as premier for both Tunis and Tonkin. He has been called the apostle of the contemporary colonial renaissance. An apostle's creed of imperialism might easily be compiled from his speeches delivered in the early 80s. Footnote: Born in 1832, Ferry became a prominent journalist and politician. As Minister of Public Instruction in the Waddington Cabinet of 1879 and the Freycinet Cabinet of 1879 through 80, he took particular interest in advocating anti-clerical school legislation. But after he became Premier in September 1880, he embarked on the Tunisian venture, which hastened his downfall in November 1881. He was again Minister of Public Instruction in the Freycinet Cabinet of 1882 and Premier from February 1883 to March 1885, during which period he took the portfolio of foreign affairs and followed an imperialist policy in Tonkin and Madagascar. He was shot by a fanatic and died in 1893. Consult A. Rambaud, Jules Ferry, Paris, 1903, and Discours et Opinions de Jules Ferry, edited by Paul Robiquet, Paris, 7 volumes, especially volumes 4 and 5. Footnote ends. There are 3 articles in the Creed. First, an industrial nation needs colonial markets, since other nations, notably Germany and the United States, have erected protective tariffs. Second, the superior races have a right as regards inferior races. They have a right because they have a duty. They have a duty of civilizing the inferior races. France must combat the slave trade.
That horrible traffic.
In Africa, she must continue her work of promoting
Justice, material and moral order, equity, social virtues.
in Africa.
Is it possible to deny,
He asked,
that it is good fortune for the unhappy populations of equatorial Africa to fall under the protectorate of the French nation or of the English nation?
There have been Englishmen since then who have denied it, but in Ferry's day the effects of imperialistic exploitation were not yet apparent. It was easy for Frenchmen to believe in the mission civilisatrice as for Englishmen to shoulder the white man's burden. Third, for a marine and naval power, coaling stations were vital. A warship could not carry coal for more than 14 days cruising, and for that reason
We needed Tunis. For that reason we needed Saigon and Cochin China. For the reason we need Madagascar and Arin Diego Suarez, which we will never leave.
In conclusion, if France refrained from imperialism, she would
Descend from the first rank to the third or fourth.
In a preface to a book on Tonkin and the mother country, he put the commercial argument with telling force.
Colonial policy is the daughter of industrial policy. The protectionist system is a steam engine without safety valve if it does not have as correlative and auxiliary a healthy and serious colonial policy. European powers of consumption are saturated. New masses of consumers must be made to arise in other parts of the globe, else we shall put modern society into bankruptcy and prepare for the dawn of the 20th century a cataclysmic social liquidation of which one cannot calculate the consequences.
It was the economic argument, after all, that had made most appeal to the upper classes. The shrewd opportunist Gambetta, speaking with regard to Tunis in 1881, was blunt enough about it.
Do you not feel the nations are stifling on this old continent? Do you not seek to create distant markets, exchanges, and to favour everywhere a necessary expansion? And necessary for what, gentlemen? Necessary for the increase of material prosperity.
Chanton, Minister of Colonies in 1895, frankly said that he was in reality
A second Minister of Commerce.
investment of capital was more emphasized at a later period, but even in 1895, Delcasse, the man who was later to become the guiding genius of French imperialism, was stressing the need of governmental protection and aid for French investments in the colonies. Still, his main point was that France enjoyed at least 200 million francs of her trade with her possessions, more than enough to compensate for the deficits in colonial budgets and easily enough to warrant the outlay of several hundred thousands to round out the empire, with a few more conquests. Alfred Rambaud and Paul Leroy-Beaulieu may be taken as typical of the academic protagonists of imperialism. Few at first, ever more numerous as the decades passed, Rimbaud, historian of Russia and the East, and first professor of contemporary history at Sorbonne, had been deeply impressed by Russian expansion, and also by Napoleonic conquests. His imagination was touched also by Seeley's Expansion of England, a translation of which he joined with J.B. Bayer in publishing in 1885. Why should not France also have a great historic mission of expansion? Such was the question that suggested itself to him. In 1886 he edited a volume containing contributions from explorers and public men under the title La France coloniale, setting forth the arguments for French imperialism. Possibly the fact that he had served as chef du cabinet for Jules Ferry, 1879-81, may help to explain Rimbaud's conversion to imperialism. Louis Beaulieu, on the other hand, was primarily an economist. As a novice, he had won a prize in 1870 for an essay on the then rather academic topic of colonization. After he became a professor of economics and finance, his mind continually reverted to this theme. In 1874 he published his treatise De la colonisation chez le peuple moderne. At that time, as he said,
public opinion in France is still almost indifferent to colonialization.
And his book was put forward as a scientific study rather than as a propagandist appeal. But when he put out a second edition in 1882, Tunis had been taken, and France was beginning to manifest
all the fervour of a new taste.
The change in public opinion was reflected in his new preface, no longer dispassionately academic, but rather ardently imperialist.
Every day that passes,
he wrote,
convinces us more and more of the importance of colonialization in general, and its importance above all for France.
He was seizing every opportunity to proclaim, by tongue or by pen, that France
has been a great colonial power, that she can and should become one again.
To be sure, France had an annual increase of population of only 100,000 souls, sufficient to provide only modest contingents of colonists, but even these would suffice, and after all, the true sinews of colonization are capital funds rather than immigrants. And of capital, France had an abundance. French foreign investments amounted already, in 1882, to 20 or 25 billion francs, and each year this figure was growing by at least $1 billion. Even a quarter of this surplus capital could be directed to the French colonies. France would succeed in creating
a great African empire and a smaller one in Asia.
Colonization, he concluded,
is for France a question of life and death. Either France will become a great African power, or in a century or two she will be no more than a secondary European power. She will count for about as much in the world as Greece or Romania in Europe.
The third edition, appearing in late 1885, found public opinion
a little weary and discouraged.
To revive confidence was the writer's patent intention, while frankly admitting the vices of French imperialism, administrative arbitrariness, over-centralization, government interference with individual concerns, lack of perseverance. He nevertheless held out bright hopes for his fellow countrymen. The concluding pages of his book glorified imperialism in dithyrambic strains.
Colonization is the expansive force of a nation, its power of reproduction, its dilation and multiplication across space. It is the submission of the universe, or a vast part of it, to the language, the manners, the ideas and laws of the mother country.
From every point of view.
Whether one restricts his view to the consideration of prosperity and material power, of authority and political influence, or lifts his eyes to the contemplation of intellectual greatness.
One incontestable truth appears, namely,
the nation that colonizes is the premier nation. If it is not today, it will be tomorrow.
But enough of such panegyrics. French imperialism in the 80s was chiefly the work of Jules Ferry, twice Premier, and his foreign minister, Jules Barthélemy Saint-Hilaire, a professor of ancient philosophy turned politician, who had been invited to inspect the Suez Canal project in 1855, and thenceforth cherished a weakness for Africa. It was taken up by the eminent historian Gabriel Hanotaux, foreign minister from 1894 to 1898, who saw in it something of historical inevitability as well as commercial gain. It was pushed to extreme lengths by Delcasse, Poincaré, and Clemenceau in the early 20th century. Footnote: it should not be implied that these men were alone in their work. Behind them were businessmen, officials, officers, supporting and often originating their policies. The influence of the Commis de l'Afrique Française was especially noteworthy. See files of its bulletin, and also H. Alice, Nos Africains, page 552. Footnote ends. During the Ferry decade of the 80s, France acquired 60,000 square miles in Asia and 1 million in Africa. In the Hanotaux decade, the 90s, 30,000 in Asia, 300,000 in Africa. In the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the period of Delcasse, Poincaré, and Clemenceau, about 1 million and a third in Africa. Such achievements might be censured by a socialist minority, but they gave the imperialists a confidence well expressed by Victor Beauregard in 1924.
The study of history reveals a conclusion which has the certainty of an axiom. France, more than any other nation, has a genius for colonization.
And he added,
The future of France is in her colonies.
Subsection: Bismarck's caution. It has often been said that Germany was born too late into the family of European nations to acquire her place in the sun, her fair share of imperial possessions. Reiteration has made the statement seem plausible. In truth, however, Germany became a united empire, the most powerful state on the continent, in ample time to participate in the imperialist world division of the 80s and 90s. It was Bismarck's stiff-necked and hard-headed opposition, and the strong free trade anti-imperialist convictions of the Reichstag majority that imposed a handicap on German empire building. In no other country was so wordy a debate, so convulsive an internal struggle, required in the process of conversion to imperialism. Theoretical writings had to be reinforced by missionary activity, commercial and financial interests, intensive propaganda, and political pressure before Germany was won over. Footnote: the controversy is best described in M. E. Townsend, Origins of Modern German Colonialism, Maximilian von Hagen, Bismarck's Colonial Politik, Stuttgart, 1924, and A. Zimmermann, Geschichte der deutschen Kolonialpolitik, Berlin, 1914. Footnote ends. For did not Bismarck stubbornly refuse the French colonies in 1870–71, rebuff proposal after proposal for the annexation of this or that choice morsel in the 70s, and repeatedly proclaim his opposition to imperialism, while hundreds of projects for the establishment of colonies were neatly bound in volumes with true German orderliness and placed on the shelf with their forerunners? A well-informed German writer claims that 30 volumes of such plans had accumulated by the year 1885. Theory alone was too weak to convince Bismarck. All through the 19th century there were theoretical exponents of imperialism. Friedrich List, the influential nationalist economist, wrote in 1841 that
colonies are the best means of developing manufactures, export and import trade, and finally, a respectable navy.
Rocher in 1848 asserted that
Germany must expand on the sea and over the sea into foreign lands if it wants to make up for the sins of past generations. New areas for production and consumption must be secured for our national interest, be they gained by means of political or economic colonization.
An official in the Prussian Foreign Office, Lothar Bücher, in 1867, reminded his compatriots that List's colonial program should be fulfilled, and specified the Philippines, St. Thomas, and Timor as desirable colonies. Among the great historians who did so much to stimulate German nationalism, Treitschke was conspicuous but not at all unique in urging imperialism.
Every virile nation,
He roundly asserted,
has established colonial power.
missionary societies reinforced the nationalist theorists. Consider, for instance, the Barmen Rhine Mission, which established 10 or more mission stations in southwest Africa, engaged extensively in trade, and, through its inspector, requested the protection of the German government. German missions were active in the Pacific Islands too, and devout Germans at home were eager to have the flag follow the gospel. But not until
The colonial movement became a business proposition.
as one historian so well says, did it make a serious impression on the anti-imperialist government. German industry and trade, having sunk thick roots in German soil during the middle of the 19th century, began to branch out into all parts of the world. The Oswald Company developed trade with Zanzibar and the eastern coast of Africa, and even obtained an offer of a protectorate over Zanzibar in 1874, an offer rebuffed by Bismarck. Voormann sent German vessels to carry the trade of the West African coast and to supply the Negroes with salt and gin. Footnote: Voormann had established factories, i.e. warehouses and stores, in Liberia, 1852, Gabon, 1862, and Cameroon, 1868. M. von Hagen, op. cit., page 18. Footnote ends. By 1880, 335,080 marks worth of German goods were annually shipped to West Africa, and 6,735,090 marks of African goods entered the port of Hamburg. It was a Bremen merchant, Luderitz, interested in African trade, who founded Germany's first colony in southwest Africa in 1883. It was a Hamburg merchant, Godefroy, who prepared the foundations for a German empire in the Pacific by building up trade with Samoa and other South Sea islands. He had a virtual monopoly of trade in copra, dried coconut meat, from which oil was extracted. It was no exaggeration to call him the South Sea King. By 1875, Germany had 50 ships trading with Samoa and the Tonga Islands. To commercial interests was added the power of finance. Not only were great merchants such as Voormann and Godefroy identified with important banks, the former with Disconto, the latter with the Norddeutsche Bank, but puissant Jewish financiers, Bleichroder, von Hansemann, etc., were friends and advisers of Bismarck, and played no insignificant role in swaying the Chancellor. Propaganda, arising in part from missionary and commercial interests, in part from disinterested patriotism, in part from the numerous German explorers of African wilds, became exceedingly active in the 70s and 80s. Scores of books and hundreds of articles and pamphlets were poured out by busy presses to urge imperialism on Germany. Typical and prominent among the propagandists was Friedrich Fabry, who by long service as inspector of the Barmen Rhine mission in southwestern Africa had become an impassioned devotee of imperialism. In a persuasive little book entitled Does Germany Need Colonies?, written in 1879, obviously for popular consumption, Fabry argued that the great stream of emigration flowing from Germany to America was the ominous symptom of an economic crisis. Germany must have colonial markets, new fields of investment, outlets for surplus population, if she would live. German culture, moreover, must be spread among the backward races. Fabry generously marked out a colonial empire to be acquired: Samoa, New Guinea, Madagascar, North Borneo, Formosa, besides commercial penetration of Central Africa and the Near East. And he suggested a method, that of letting the flag follow the trader in these regions. A second figure towering tall in the legion of propagandists was Wilhelm Huberschleiden, lawyer, businessman, publicist, and, for a time, explorer in tropical Africa. His voluminous writings, especially in his books Ethiopian Studien über Westafrika, 1879, and Deutsche Kolonisation, in 1881, and his personal influence were devoted to the conversion of the younger generation from self-satisfied nationalism and from equally insidious cosmopolitanism to the new gospel of Weltpolitik, of imperialism. Germany, he wrote, must break away from the Anglo-Saxon free trade and cosmopolitanism. These were devices which had enabled England to obtain 70% of the world's trade at the expense of competing nations. Germany's future greatness, her honour as a nation, her prosperity depended upon learning to think imperially in terms of Weltpolitik. Ethiopia, West Central Africa, and South America were to be the fields of German colonization. Huberschleiden, it is interesting to note, was a prominent member of the Westdeutsche Verein für Kolonisation und Export, founded by Fabry in 1880, and joined with other members in founding a Guinea Company in 1882, supported by Hamburg merchant princes, for the establishment of colonies on the western coast of Africa. This venture failed, but others took its place. A most powerful agency of propaganda was the Colonial Verein, founded in 1882 by a merchant, Friedrich Colin, a traveller, Freiherr von Malzen, and a widely read and travelled prince, Hohenlohe-Langenberg, an interesting group of journalists, explorers, shippers, merchants, and geographers. Our acquaintances Fabry and Huberschleiden were, of course, to be found in this array. By 1885, the Colonial Verein had more than 10,000 members, many of whom were influential in the business world, the press, the universities, and the government. While the Colonial Verein devoted itself chiefly to general propaganda in favour of imperialism, the Gesellschaft für Deutsche Kolonisation, founded by Dr. Karl Peters in 1884, had the more practical aim of raising capital to establish colonies in East Africa. As an imaginative youth, Peters had caught the fever of imperialism while on a visit to England. Returning to Germany in 1883, and finding it impossible to carry the Colonial Verein with him in his enthusiastic projects, Peters in 1884 founded the Gesellschaft für Deutsche Kolonisation, issued 50-mark shares, and raised 4 million marks capital. With characteristic impetuosity he made his way, through the most romantic adventures, to Eastern Africa to buy up land from the natives. His exploit will be described more fully in its proper place, but his name belongs here as one of the chief apostles who evangelized Germany for imperialism. Footnote: compare Infra, page 123. See Imperialism and World Politics Part 2, Section 1. Chapter 7, The Conquest and Exploitation of East Africa. Footnote ends. All of these forces of economic theory, of religion, of commerce and finance, of propaganda, conspired to alter Bismarck's anti-imperialist policy. In the years 1875 through 1883 occurred his conversion. As early as 1876 he told the merchant Luderitz, who desired to make Transvaal a German colony, that he favoured colonization in principle, but must wait for further development of national spirit before taking action. This may have been little more than ordinary political suavity, but we find Bismarck showing by his deeds an increased interest in Africa and the Pacific. He protests to Spain against interference with German trade in the Sulu Islands. He allows trade treaties to be made with swarthy potentates in the unclaimed South Sea Islands. His change of heart was hastened by a political crisis. When sensing the decline of liberalism and needing increased federal revenues, he decided to adopt a protective tariff in 1879, and relied on the Conservatives and Centre instead of the National Liberal Party. Bismarck needed the support which the rising imperialist faction could give his new protectionist policy. To have influential imperialist merchants actively supporting him in the free trade cities of Hamburg and Bremen was no small consideration, and Bismarck was willing to pay for such support in the coinage of political favours. Intent purely on European affairs, the shrewd Chancellor kept his opinions to himself, pretty largely, until a favourable opportunity for action should arise. The opportunity came in 1879. The Godefroy firm, ambitiously reaching out for trade among the islands of the South Pacific, had formed a merger in 1878, the Deutsche Handels- und Plantagengesellschaft des Südseeinseln, German Trade and Plantation Company of the South Sea Islands. Getting into financial difficulties, Godefroy had borrowed heavily from London bankers Baring Brothers, and had pledged as security a large block of shares in the South Sea merger. Godefroy's bankruptcy in 1879 placed German ownership of this merger, therefore, in grave jeopardy. It was time for Bismarck to act. Godefroy was perhaps the most influential firm in Hamburg, and loyal to the administration. Bismarck's method was characteristically cautious. With his encouragement, a new company, the Deutsche Seehandelsgesellschaft, was formed in January 1880 with two prominent Jewish financiers, Bleichroder and Hansemann, as directors-in-chief, representing the Chancellor. For his part, Bismarck rushed through the Bundesrat a bill to guarantee the company with an annual subsidy of 4% from the imperial treasury for 20 years, or until its dividends should reach a satisfactory figure. In the Reichstag, however, the Samoan subsidy bill encountered furious opposition from the liberal parties, whose leaders refused to be deceived either by official attempts to disguise the bill as a purely commercial measure, or by contradictory official declarations that
it is not a question of party or free trade or protection, but one of the honour and glory of Germany.
the
Waving of the national flag and blaring of trumpets,
as one opposition speaker put it, was of no avail. The bill was rejected, 128 to 112. Between the rejection of the Samoan subsidy bill in April 1880 and the establishment of Germany's first protectorate in 1884, Bismarck discreetly felt his way, favouring imperialism, but hesitating to arouse sleeping dogs in the Reichstag. It was during these years that the Colonial Verein and similar organisations let loose a flood of propaganda, while imperialist merchants planned ventures with more or less secret connivance from the government, which could be presented to the Reichstag as fait accompli. The propaganda had its effect, and the imperialist activities of England and France at this time gave an additional stimulus to German imperialism, with the result that by 1884 Germany was ready. In that year Bismarck proclaimed a protectorate over southwest Africa. Rapidly other protectorates followed, Cameroon and Togoland on the western coast of Africa, part of East Africa also, and part of New Guinea and the adjacent islands in the South Seas. Bismarck, however, was too much preoccupied with his system of alliances in Europe ever to become a furious imperialist. He remained unwilling to make conquests and annexations, as the French did, simply for the sake of rounding out a colonial empire. On the contrary, he insisted that the way must first be paved by German merchants. The flag might follow trade, but would not precede it. As a result, Bismarck carved out only a relatively modest colonial empire. It was after the accession of Wilhelm II and the dismissal of Bismarck, 1890, that German imperialism reached its apogee. Inclined by temperament to the grandiose and flamboyant, and keenly interested in Germany's commercial expansion, the new Kaiser threw himself without reservation or reticence into the enterprise of enlarging Bismarck's empire. In the period 1890 to 1914, the protectorates in Africa were extended. The German flag was hoisted over hundreds of South Sea islands. A port was obtained on the Chinese coast. Through the Baghdad Railway, German imperialism penetrated and dominated Turkey, and even more than these additions would have been made, had there been less opposition from jealous competitors. German parties still opposing imperialism were converted or defeated. Even in the Socialist Party, an influential faction willingly learned to mouth the arguments for empire. Subsection. Others share the burden. Italy, like Germany, achieved nationhood just before the dawn of the day of imperialist world politics. Unlike Germany, however, the new nation of Italy was industrially backward and politically weak. Although many Italian patriots, mindful of Rome's ancient grandeur, cherished imperial aspirations, the country was neither weak enough to be permitted by other great powers to acquire colonies which might be exploited by them, nor strong enough to risk the enmity of powerful neighbours. With self-abnegation born of impotence, Italians looked on, furious but helpless, while imperialist France appropriated the most natural field for Italian expansion, Tunis, on the African coast just south of Italy, the site of ancient Rome's vanquished rival, Carthage. Italy could do nothing until she had allies sufficiently powerful to bolster her claims. Grasping this fact, the then Premier, Agostino de Pretis, sued for the favour of Germany and, after difficult negotiations, obtained admission to a triple alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1882, the year after the French seizure of Tunis. He also made a beginning of empire by taking possession of a port, Massawa, on the western coast of the Red Sea, but he could do no more. His successor, the astute Francesco Crispi, obtained from Germany, when the Triple Alliance was renewed in 1887, a secret pledge of aid in case France should attempt to conquer Tripoli or Morocco. Tripoli, at least, he hoped to gain for Italy. He also enlarged Italy's foothold on the Red Sea coast, obtained another foothold farther south in Somaliland, and intrigued to gain possession of the great state of Abyssinia, which lay between these two Italian colonies. But an evil fate pursued him. A disastrous battle with the natives shattered his hopes in Abyssinia, nor could he create any favourable opportunity for the realization of his designs on Tripoli. Italian imperialism was checked. The imperial impulse, being balked rather than sated, did but grow stronger, and, as the individual consciousness of actual inferiority seeks compensation in dreams of power, the ruling class of Italy waxed more ardently imperialist, and dreamed more extravagant projects to restore Rome's ancient sway over the Mediterranean coastlands. In the 20th century, Italy was ready to send her armies once more into Africa for conquest, and during the Great War and after, to manifest an imperialist hunger too keen to be sated with the colonial crumbs that fell from the Allies' table. Very different was the case of Russia. As an ever-expanding empire of peasants and horsemen, Russia had pushed eastward into Siberia, southward toward Constantinople and toward the Caucasus, and westward to the Baltic, long before the fever of modern imperialism infected Western Europe. Russia's early expansion was the work of restless frontiersmen seeking new homes in virgin lands, and of ambitious Tsars seeking warm water, outlets, windows to the west. It was not the imperialism of surplus manufactures, surplus capital, and national pride, but in the late 19th century, though Russia as a whole remained agricultural, giant industries developed in Russian cities, capitalists arose, and imperialist doctrines identical with those of Western Europe gained currency among the ruling classes. Capitalist projects for railway construction in Manchuria, capitalist interests in Persia, intensified the historic aggressiveness of Russia, and French financiers, after about 1890, supplied for Russian imperialism surplus capital which Russia herself lacked. For instance, the Russian Asiatic Bank, the agent of Russian imperialism in the Far East, was financed with French capital. Austria-Hungary, like Russia, developed imperialism as an intensification of historic expansionist policies and sought to dominate neighbouring countries rather than to acquire overseas colonies. The emancipation of Germany and Italy from Vienna's control, occurring on the eve of the imperialist era, turned the Habsburg monarchy to seek compensation in the Balkan Peninsula. The desire for compensation was stimulated by economic interests of bankers and exporters, as well as by the political motive of bolstering up a tottering throne by means of a strong foreign policy, and, after 1890, by the German Drang nach Osten. Austrian capitalists purchased Balkan railways, while Austrian diplomats conducted subtle intrigues looking toward annexation of Bosnia and domination of the Balkan states. For most small nations, imperialism was out of the question. They lacked capital, and, above all, they lacked strength to vie successfully with great powers. The Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Denmark, however, possessed colonies which had been obtained in earlier times. In these cases, pride of possession was enhanced by the outburst of imperialism among the great powers. Portugal and Spain even attempted to expand their holdings in Africa. Belgium entered the race largely because of the initiative of an unusually ambitious and foresighted ruler, Leopold II, who perceived the first flush of the dawning day of imperialism early enough to carve out for himself a huge empire, the Congo Free State, in Central Africa, before the great powers had parcelled that continent out among themselves. This venture, a personal enterprise of Leopold II, rather than a national undertaking, ultimately gave Belgium possession of the Congo and an important place among imperialist nations. Belgian imperialism, like Russian imperialism, afforded an indirect outlet for French surplus capital. Imperialism, in the form that has been so conspicuous since 1875, is a peculiarly European product, but it has been acclimated in non-European nations, in proportion as they progressed in the economic institutions and political ideas characteristic of Western Europe. Japan, apt imitator of Europe, became strongly and aggressively imperialist toward the close of the 19th century, after textile and metallurgical industries, export commerce and finance had developed on European lines, to the point of requiring foreign markets for surplus goods, foreign supplies of raw material, foreign investments for surplus capital, and, after Japanese political sentiment, forsaking old ideals of exclusion and conservatism, had become poignantly eager to maintain national prestige by doing successfully what the European great powers were doing. America has not yet been converted, certainly not wholly converted, to European imperialism. Traditional principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence have militated against imperialism in theory, while an abundance of unoccupied land, a prodigal profusion of undeveloped resources, and a lack of surplus capital and surplus manufactures until very recently have obstructed it in practice. The westward expansion of the United States, accomplished prior to the age of imperialism, was dictated partly by slaveholding interests, eager to add new territory and new votes to the strength of the cotton-raising slavocracy, and partly by the westward urge of pioneer and prospector, and partly by an exuberant confidence in America's manifest destiny to expand. But conquering overseas possessions was quite another matter, distasteful to the prevalent opinions. Not until the close of the 19th century had American nationalism and American business enterprise reached the stage attained a generation earlier in Europe. At the time of the Spanish War of 1898, there was a vigorous imperialist movement, but after the excitement of the war had subsided, imperialism too declined. Washington officials and New York businessmen have since then cooperated in more or less imperialistic enterprises in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean area, but America has not yet embarked on a policy of open, enthusiastic, aggressive imperialism, frankly eager for colonial possessions the world over. But of this, more must be said in a later chapter, when we have more of the facts before us. Up to this point, our inquiry has shown that an anti-imperialist free trade Europe was converted to imperialism rather suddenly in the 70s and 80s, when England began to feel the competition of other industrial rivals, when manufacturing nations began to raise protective tariff walls around their own markets and to compete bitterly for foreign markets, when steamships and railways provided facilities for world commerce and conquest, when greedy factories and hungry factory towns called out for raw materials and foodstuffs, when surplus capital rapidly accumulating sought investments in backward countries, when the doctrine of economic nationalism triumphed over the old individualistic liberalism. The next step in our investigation is to discover the dynamics of imperialism. Borrowing to some extent the method of the sociologist, we must inquire more specifically what classes or groups of men and what motives have been responsible for imperialism. End of section 4.